Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we have what promises to be a very illuminating and fascinating program for you this afternoon, featuring architecture critic Alexandra Lange, here to talk about her new book, Meet Me by the Fountain, an inside history of the mall. A few brief housekeeping notes first, though. Masks, as you may all be aware, are currently required in the store, so please keep yours on during the event. You'll see those of us up here speaking not wearing our masks. When we get to the Q&A portion a bit later, if you have a question, just step up to the microphone right here next to the pillar. That way we can pick up your question on the tape, because we are recording this event for our YouTube channel. And at the end, while we would normally ask you to fold up your chairs, don't do that this time, because we have another event later. Now, a few words about Alexandra. She's a design and architecture critic whose writing often has focused on public projects. The best architecture critics, like the best critics of food or fashion or film, they don't just confine their reviews to the particular meal, clothing, movie, or building in front of them. They expand their commentary to provide larger historical, cultural, and societal context for the specific thing that they're writing about. And Alexandra has done this in her previous work, which includes 4 books, and she's done it again impressively and very informatively in Meet Me by the Fountain. This is not some dry history about the rise, demise, and ongoing reinvention of shopping malls in America. It's a very engaging, insightful, and frequently entertaining book about a subject that has been a source both of much nostalgia and derision. And a subject that, of course, a lot of us think we know something about because we've all shopped in malls. In fact, Alexandra admits to having been a bit apprehensive at first about approaching the mall as a subject of serious study. But then she discovered how responsive people were when she mentioned the project. They nearly always replied with something like, oh, let me tell you about my mall experience. Alexandra calls the mall an architecture born to be malleable. And she takes us from its advent in the 1950s as an addition to post-war suburban planning through its use in later decades to enliven downtown industrial buildings or turn urban streets into pedestrian zones, and through its manifestations as giant amusement centers. She addresses the conventional wisdom that the mall is dead, and also looks at what the future might hold for this ubiquitous architectural form that she argues still has something to offer. Reviews of the book have been quite positive. The Wall Street Journal commended it as thorough, serious, and engaging. Publishers Weekly called it lucid and well-researched, and the Los Angeles Times termed it smart and accessible. Conversation with Alexandra this afternoon will be Amanda Kolson Hurley, who's a journalist and author with experience covering architecture and urban planning, as well as climate change and politics. She's currently an editor at Bloomberg Green and the author 3 years ago of Radical Suburbs, which explored a number of case studies in suburban social experimentation. So please join me in welcoming Alexandra Hurley and Alexandra Lange and Amanda Kolson Hurley.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming. It's really fun to be here today. I have never been to this bookstore before, but I've heard about it for many years, and it's always nice to put the place to the name. I'm just going to start by kind of setting the scene with reading a little bit from my introduction, and then I know that Amanda has many questions for me. From the turnpike, the American dream was a great gray blob. An earlier version of this mall, then named Meadowlands Xanadu, had worn its tacky heart on its sleeve. Its vast expanse a riot of blocks and stripes of color. The patterns dramatizing the precipitous angle of the indoor ski slope as it rose from the parking lot. But now the building reposed glumly on the roadside horizon, less distinct than the green sweep of the Meadowlands or the bowl of MetLife Stadium. Only in one spot, the outward curve of the Nickelodeon roller coaster, did American Dream's facade break its doorness, as if this ride alone could not be contained. Inside, despite my multi-year study of the history of malls, I found myself lost. Atrium seemed to follow atrium, one with a chandelier, one with a vaulted wood ceiling, one with a plastic garden, without any sense of hierarchy or connection back to the outdoors. Long halls papered with photographs suggested that one day glamorous stores might follow, but the stores that were there, Zara, Bath & Body Works, Amazon 4-star, weren't anything I needed to leave New York City to visit. Down in the lower level, near the mini golf and aquarium, signs of life. The scent of Auntie Anne's, a pastel boba storefront, masked families on their travels to the ski slope, to the indoor beach, to the candy store. After more than a year of quarantine, largely confined to my Brooklyn neighborhood, I found myself touched and thrilled by their linked hands. In May 2021, when it seemed like the summer might bring an end to the COVID-19 pandemic, seeing parents and children out and about having fun together brought me a spike of joy. I wanted to see people, I wanted to watch people, I wanted to be among people. We were all seeking that at the mall.
Thank you very much for that. Maybe your experience at the American Dream that day gives a glimmer of this, but people don't tend to think of malls as works of architecture. There's some, I would say, some real snobbery towards the mall. Why do you think that is?
Well, yeah, and the epigraph to the book is a quote from my favorite architecture critic, Ada Louise Huxtable, longtime critic for the New York Times, basically dissing the whole project of the mall as these great gray blobs plopped on the roadside. So yes, I felt that, in order to write this book, first I had to contend with the snobbery within myself that I had learned from critics like Ada Louise Huxtable and Michael Sorkin that I really admired. So part of the process of writing the book was kind of casting that off and saying, okay, like they had one point of view, but I think our point of view on architecture changes generation by generation. And like my generation, Gen X and younger, has a really different relationship to the mall. And the mall has kind of grown beyond its architectural origins, that they were looking at it purely as an object on the roadside. But what was important to me was really to get into its social and cultural importance. On top of that, though, like many important architects have designed malls. So even if you're just going for the pure snob factor, like you can go to a mall designed by Frank Gehry, you can go to a mall designed by I.M. Pei, you can go to a mall designed by Renzo Piano. So like that's not actually a fair judgment.
That's true, although I think Renzo Piano won't call his mall a mall, isn't that right?
Yes. He calls it a piazza because everything has to be a piazza. And yes, we all understand that, everything sounds better with an Italian accent, but it's still a mall.
So one question I had for you, as I was reading, you described this tension about, how malls, they blur the line between public and private. So there are these big social gathering spaces, but they're also privately owned and managed and surveilled. I was really struck by how far back that tension goes. Could you talk a little bit about when it first cropped up in the history of the mall?
Sure. Yeah, I think that a lot of people regard the mall in their town as the town square, the public space. And so they don't think about the fact that the land underneath is privately owned, that the mall owner is paying for the cleaning staff, is paying for the security staff, et cetera, et cetera. And that became a problem, in a sense, a legal problem, starting in the 1960s. There's a famous case, the Logan Valley Plaza case, that came up before the Supreme Court in 1968. That basically, the question of the case was, is the mall public and private? And this came up because people wanted to protest about union labor at Logan Valley Plaza. And the owners said, you can't protest on our property. And so this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Thurgood Marshall, writing for the majority, wrote a really interesting decision where he said, yes, you can protest on their property. And there's a paragraph in the decision where he says, it's clear that malls have become the new town square. And if we say that people can't protest in malls, we're denying people that very important public forum for democracy, and basically forcing people to the margins to create protest. So I just felt like he had like an insight very early on, and like very well articulated in the decision, about how malls were already seen as part of society and how they needed to function so that marginalized people weren't denied, a place in the center to make their point.
And speaking of the Supreme Court, I wonder if there are people protesting in the Mall of America today, or,
Well, you can't protest at the Mall of America. I mean, there's, as I get into in the book, there's then a long tangled history of the public versus private question, and as the Supreme Court has become more conservative, they eventually came down on the side of the mall owners that no protest was allowed, and then kicked the whole question back to the states. So in some states, you can protest at the mall, and in other states, you cannot. Minnesota is one of those states that you cannot, and in the book, I talk about some Black Lives Matter protesters that brought their fight to the Mall of America and were kicked out, and arrested. So.
One term that comes up in the book again and again throughout is the Greuen Transfer. This is such a great concept. Can you explain it for those who aren't familiar?
Sure. So Victor Greuen is the subject of the first chapter of the book, and he is really the father of the mall, the maestro of the mall. Just very briefly, he was a Viennese emigre who wanted to bring kind of the beauty of the Viennese sidewalk cafe to the center of the American suburbs. So he also realized that people would spend more money if you could get them to forget that they came to the mall with a list of things that they wanted to buy. And that is essentially the Greuen Transfer. The Greuen Transfer is the moment when you forget why you're at the mall and you're just having a good time being at the mall.
So Victor Greuen was really important to the history of mall design. Another person I really enjoyed reading about in the book was John Jurdy. Can you talk a little bit about his contribution and maybe how it was different to what Greuen brought?
Yeah, so Jurdy is a California architect who really rose to prominence in the 80s and brought a very postmodern kind of scenographic, pastiche-laden sensibility to mall design. And he was somebody that very much was fighting against the architectural establishment. He kind of hated how much credit people like, Caesar Pelli got for, and I.M. Pei got for being great architects, when he felt like his buildings actually hosted many more people more successfully. And he's the architect behind the Mall of America. And so his great innovation was realizing that maybe people weren't so interested in shopping for the sake of shopping anymore, but that the mall should start to be a place of entertainment. So the Mall of America, I don't know how many of you have been there, has an amusement park in the middle of the mall, which I think is just such an amazing gesture. At which meeting did he just suddenly, turn to his client and say, you know what you need? Forget the fountain, we need an amusement park. So he felt like, okay, the mall's getting bigger, we want to appeal to families. Yes, your boring old Greuen Mall has a little carousel, but we can have a roller coaster. And that is going to really kind of ramp up the excitement. It will also keep people in the mall longer so that they will buy more things. But we can have Disney World in the mall in Minnesota in the dead of winter.
Do you think that was kind of prescient? Because he was saying this in the 80s, and of course now department stores are really struggling. And yeah, I think more malls are relying on entertainment options, right? As kind of to fill in those gaps that the old anchors left.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and one of the things I say in the book is that while I don't think malls as a whole are doomed, I actually do think that department stores are doomed. And because they are typically the anchors of malls, they can really, you know, pull the whole thing down with them. Because if you look down at the end of the mall and you see this big dark store, like that does not give you a good feeling about the place that you're in. But yeah, a lot of smaller malls, you know, kind of regular regional malls have put gyms with like fancy climbing walls, trampoline parks, go-kart racing places into the spaces that department stores used to occupy. Because as, you know, a greater percentage of shopping has moved online, like a lot of people don't need to do that kind of everyday, I would say like JCPenney shopping, but they will leave their houses and go to the mall for something like a trampoline park that you can't really replicate at home.
Yeah. So there's been a trend a lot of people are probably familiar with over the past, 10 years or so, of kind of art focusing on dead malls, right? As a lot of malls have declined, photographers go in and take these kind of haunting photos of, the silent food court, the shuttered stores, the crumbling atrium. You're not hugely a fan of this. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about why not.
Yeah. I mean, in the introduction, he alluded to the fact that most people, when I said I was writing a book about malls, were like, let me tell you about my mall. And then they told me a whole childhood story. But the other people, let's say 30% of the people I mentioned the book to, said, oh, so you're writing a book about dead malls. And that kind of hurt my heart because, like, I wouldn't want to spend like many years of my life writing about something that was dead. Like, that's just me. But I had to figure out how to talk about dead malls in a way that seemed to me kind of interesting and creative. And I found that in the fact that I really do admire the photography of many dead malls. I mean, they're beautiful photographs and they fit into this long history of what people often call ruin porn. I mean, Piranesi drew ruins. There are photographs of, old abandoned movie theaters, all these things. It's a whole genre, and malls fall into that. But to me, I feel like those photographs suggest that the mall is at an end. Like, this is over. And they don't really engage with the question of what happens to it, like what could it become, like what happens around it in the city. It's just this kind of aesthetic object. So I feel like those photos can actually be fairly destructive, sort of to people's imagination about malls. So I talk about them in the book as part of a whole sweep of kind of art made from malls, but then talk about like why I find it problematic and how, I basically think there are things to be done with these dead spaces and we shouldn't just let them be these objects of aesthetic contemplation.
Right. So in terms of things to be done, I was curious, you actually offer quite a lot of examples, I think, but was there a moment in researching the book where you were looking at different examples of malls, or you were walking through one and said, yeah, this is it. This is where I see malls heading. This is the future of the mall right here that I'm encountering.
Well, I guess I feel like my favorite example, and I almost feel like I've used this example too much, is the Austin Community College, the Highland campus, because it used to be the Highland Mall, which was the first indoor mall in Austin. So there are a lot of people who grew up in Austin who have like a lot of memories of that mall. But then about 10 years ago, it became defunct because a new fancy mall called the Domain that has like the Apple Store and outside seating and walking around opened. So Highland Mall was defunct. And ACC, the community college, bought it in partnership with a development company, and they created this whole master plan to be developed over 10 to 15 years for the whole mall site. And it's partially a campus for the community college, but they're also building new housing on the parking lots. They've created some new green spaces to kind of break up the buildings. And it's also now the offices for the Austin Public TV station, and it's on the light rail. So to me, this is just like all these elements in place. There's green space, there's public transportation, there's housing, there's a college, but there's also like new office space. And I think it shows how much you can pack into what was once just a big empty parking lot with a mall in the middle. And since so many of the dead malls are in like first and second ring suburbs that have already become more dense than they were when they were originally built and need to become more dense, you know, to fulfill our need for, you know, housing and more walkable communities, I just feel like showing what range of things you can put on a former mall site is really exciting. And so that example really gets to me.
That's great. Yeah, and I guess a lot of malls were built by freeway interchanges in kind of pretty central or convenient, central within a kind of metropolitan area locations. And so the idea that you would let that as a stock of reusable land, that you wouldn't seize that and make it into something new does seem quite wasteful. Like,
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, there's actually an anecdote about Edward DiBartolo, who was a big mall developer based initially in Ohio. And he used to like go up in a private plane and basically look for new highway interchanges that didn't have anything built around them and say, okay, like let's put the mall there. So like those early mall developers were really just kind of picking from these like this new highway-driven American landscape. Like they could see that the same pattern was being repeated outside many different cities, and so they knew where to put a mall. But now the whole circumstances around those interchanges are completely different. But one thing that several people pointed out to me was because, you know, now even a young mall is 30 years old, people know where to find them. And I think during the pandemic, a lot of malls, either the parking lots or the defunct department stores, were turned into COVID testing and then COVID vaccination sites. And that was partially because a city could just say, if you go to Citadel Mall, you know, from 9 to 5, like just drive in and get your vaccination. Like you didn't have to say where it was. Like everyone knew where the mall was. And there's actually like capital wrapped up in that name recognition and that geographical recognition. And that's another thing that I think reworked malls can capitalize on.
Yeah, it's interesting. In this area, of course, we have, I mean, there are many malls, but we have Tysons, which is a successful and still successful mall, I believe, but is sort of the linchpin of this really ambitious new urbanization plan out in Fairfax County that includes, you know, transit and an attempt to make a walkable district, but still keeping the mall there because it's Class A. I can't remember what the term is. Is it not regional, super regional, or what's the term?
Yeah, super regional.
Super regional.
Well, there's super regional, and there's also like a AAA rating. But, well, that's a whole weird research question, that like rabbit hole that I went down. The origins of the ABCD mall rating system turn out to be like lost to the sands of time. But anyway, but super regional is what it is. And I don't talk much about Tysons specifically, but I talk about the Houston Galleria, which is in the Post Oak neighborhood in Houston, which is was started with very similar ambitions of basically creating a new downtown satellite to a major city with a mall as its centerpiece. So Tysons can be seen as part of this push to like use the mall as literally the main street of these new towns and actually built quite dense fabric around them. So that's kind of after the first wave of just suburban malls, people start to think about the city again and think about density again.
My last question is about, again, going back to mall art, but not dead mall art, but or entirely. But you mentioned so many examples of movies and books that reference the mall, from Dawn of the Dead to Gone Girl, to even The Breakfast Club, right? In a sort of slightly oblique way. But was there any piece of mall culture or mall-themed culture that really resonated with you, or that you discovered through this process that you particularly like?
Well, I guess this wasn't a discovery, but like one of my favorite movies is Clueless, and it's still, I don't even like the book Emma, the Jane Austen book that it's based on, but Clueless I can stand. And so one of the fun things in working on this project for me was realizing the things that I already liked and already knew about actually intersected with the mall. So in Clueless, there's this scene where I think the kind of critical moment is Cher and Christian like come up on this escalator into the center of this Los Angeles mall under a barrel vaulted glass roof, and they're kind of framed by the architecture of the mall, like looking as beautiful and glamorous as possible. I think Cher even like does a hair toss as they get to the top of the escalator, and realizing like how important this scene was for Clueless, but just how that whole framing of this kind of white upper middle class teenagerdom was done in this particular movie that is a classic, was really important. So I guess to me it was this realization that the mall had already kind of infiltrated my cultural memories, and then being able to link that up to some larger points about the architecture of the mall, where teenagers hang out in the mall, sort of like which parts of the mall are for which people, was really fun. So it's like, oh, I already knew this, but now I have to actually write it out and kind of excavate it from my brain.
Thank you. I think at this point we can invite people who have questions to please come up to the microphone.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Is this good? Okay. I know you were pitching like how people are using mall spaces, like implementing go-karts and like now defunct department stores, or repurposing like defunct malls, but I'm wondering like what you personally think like current designers or innovators are missing. Like you saw like a swath of things that are in like the contemporary meta, but what do you personally think is missing from either using department store space or using like an entire abandoned mall as a whole?
That's a good question. I mean, in the book I have a lot of different examples for things, so I feel like they kind of run the gamut, from like food marketplaces combining kind of amped up food courts where you can get fresh food but also prepared food and also eat in a restaurant. But there are also other examples where people have public library branches in former department stores. There are like healthcare functions in former department stores. Like I'm trying to think if there's something that I really haven't. I feel like people have thought of almost everything. What's interesting to me is I don't think there has been kind of coalescence around like what's the best idea or what's going to fit in the most department stores. And I think that's interesting because there just may not be one answer. I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to have like Amanda up here with me is that she wrote this book called Radical Suburbs, which is trying to kind of complicate our idea of what the suburbs is. And one of the things I mentioned in the book is that suburbs are so much more diverse now than they were when malls were built. So I actually think that probably more different things have to happen in malls because they should be more specifically tweaked to the communities that they now find themselves in. So I think the possibilities are kind of endless, but I think that most of them have been done like at least in one place.
Sure. I guess as like a prodding question to that,
Okay.
then I'm wondering, was there any sort of use of space in either of those two spaces that kind of like you hadn't thought like this is possible, and then it just works when you see it like in the ecosystem or in the infrastructure?
Well, I think, most department stores in malls are just these blank boxes, right? Because they actually want to be able to control all of the interior space and have artificial lighting because that makes the clothes look better and it's easier to set up displays. So I think what's interested me is when architects and one of the buildings at the Austin Community Colleges like this have cut skylights into the department stores, and suddenly you're like, oh, this is really a big, beautiful like box of space that once the escalator has a skylight coming down over it, you see that, you know, it's open span with just a few columns, and it can almost seem like a beautiful minimalist space like you might see at a museum. So I think it's more like once you clean them out but don't make them depressing,
Yeah.
like you start to see them as I wrote, like as really malleable spaces. That this architecture that we think of as being, you know, for this one really specific thing, shopping, actually has a lot more possibilities and is much simpler than we realize. And once you see it as this very simple series of, you know, two big boxes and then lots of little boxes for the boutiques, it's like, oh, the little boutique box could be a classroom. Or, I mean, I interviewed a guy who's putting like mini aquariums into former boutiques in malls, and he even reuses some of the equipment from the former boutiques to create cool surrounds for the fish tanks and things like that. So it's like, yeah, it's stripping them out but not making them depressing so that you can actually start to have imagination about something else going in there.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Alec McRae. For the past 50 years, I've lived a block away from Spring Valley Mall, which is the oldest mall in Washington, D.C. I believe it was established in 1933. My question is, or a little more background, Spring Valley Mall is now a historical landmark. And whether or not anything is sold there in the future, which it probably will be, it can't be changed. It's there as a historical landmark. My question is, how many malls in the United States, at a rough estimate, have you heard of that become historical landmarks, either working or non-working malls, and what's the future for the mall as a historical landmark?
That's a great question. The malls that I know of that are historical landmarks are actually from the same vintage as that one, and we would now call them shopping centers because they tend to be open air, whereas a mall is an indoor shopping experience. So, of course. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember the names. Country Club Plaza in Kansas City is usually called the first shopping center. It's 1922, and it has this kind of Spanish Moorish architecture. And then there's also Highland Park Plaza in Dallas that also has like somewhat exoticized architecture, which is like 1925 or so. So those are all historic landmarks. I don't know of any indoor malls that are historic landmarks, but as part of kind of the publicity for my book and creating partnerships with people that are involved in preservation, Daco Momo, which is a modernist preservation organization, has actually made shopping malls their theme of the year. And so their members across the country are doing research on the malls in their towns to try to get some of them landmarked. Like recently, I found out that there are 5 or 6 Lord & Taylor stores in the tri-state area that were designed by Raymond Loewy, the famous industrial designer. And they're very beautiful, kind of streamlined white buildings that say Lord & Taylor on the outside. And so there's some thought that like those might be able to be landmarked because they are designed by a famous architect, even though they're for shopping. Unfortunately, a lot of malls have been heavily remodeled over the years. Southdale by Victor Greuen, 1956, which is the first indoor shopping mall, like I think would be an obvious candidate for landmarking, but it's been changed so much you'd end up, I think, just landmarking little bits and pieces of it. So it's difficult because most of them have changed over the years and there isn't so much historical fabric.
So I have a question, Alexandra. I know your book's about the American mall. Can you say anything, though, about the mall in Europe or other countries outside of Europe and how it relates to the experience in the United States?
Sure. And actually, the conclusion to my book talks about malls in other places, as you may know, because I think it's really interesting how, as Americans, we tend to think of the mall as ours, but there were malls built in Britain, starting in the 1950s also, but the whole trajectory of them and the financing structure, et cetera, is really different. In the UK, the malls were often built in center cities as part of creating new towns, so it was more like the Tysons or the Houston Galleria version of the mall, where this was going to become this nexus for a new city. Whereas that's actually the way that malls are being built in the Philippines and in South America now. When they'll put in a new light rail stop outside a city, they'll build a mall around it and then build apartments so that the mall is much better integrated into public transportation networks. And often these new malls, even if the stores are luxury shops, they'll always have fun activities for families to come to with children. So even people who can't really afford the stores will go to the mall on a weekend sort of as a social event. So yeah, I think there's a lot that American malls can now learn from these different trajectories in different parts of the world. And a lot of it has to do with how they handle the public space and the public access.
Hello, I'm Neil.
Hi.
Just on the point about the landmarking buildings, I believe actually the Lord and Taylor's was either landmarked or is about on the docket to be landmarked up in Friendship Heights. It's kind of an Edward Earl Stone building. The question was maybe more about malls kind of as anti-architectural, in that, as you know, if you design a store in a mall, there's some level of expectation of creativity, and the mall has to be able to absorb the branding and the sort of particular needs of that. And like you're saying, it's sometimes they are just big empty spaces for the retail designers to go. So I'd be curious about your feelings on that.
Well, yes, one thing that the mall has to do is be a frame for these brands that are changing all of the time. And it's funny because, architecture, snobby architecture, let's say, likes to set itself up as permanent. And so the mall, messes up that system because there's all this impermanence, and it, in fact, has to be designed for impermanence. That said, I think that there are ways that you can design for impermanence and also make the framework permanent and also make that framework beautiful. And the best example of that, which I write about in the second chapter, is North Park in Dallas, which is a mall that was built in 1965 and designed by architects who had worked for Minoru Yamasaki and Eero Saarinen. And for example, it has polished concrete floors and white brick walls, and every storefront is surrounded by one width of white brick, in a perfect frame, and then it has these cast stone ornaments, they call it the bug, in the two corners of this framework for the store. And that's true across the mall, and when they added on to the mall in 2006, they copied that for the new part of the mall. And so if you see one of the stores without anything in it, you immediately know you're at North Park. And it's plain enough that it still looks quite contemporary even today. So that to me is the best way to make your mall be both architectural in and of itself, but also a framework for these other crazy brands.
So North Park isn't landmarked then? It seems like that would be a likely one.
It would be a likely one. It's not, but I feel like the family that still owns it would want that. They're incredibly proud of it. So, that would be another good candidate. Hi.
Hey, I'm Brian. I wanted to ask about, a lot of the imagery that you pulled up, shared in your research, et cetera, was all these malls that were really ambitious in ways aesthetically that are super on trend now, like really lush plants. Obviously, even the title, Meade by the Fountains, like we've had a huge resurgence of like indoor fountains, big stepped seating areas. It's like really signature art installations on a large scale, a lot of stuff that's like really trendy in interior environments now. But when I think to like the kind of era of personal significance for me in malls of like the 80s, early 90s, etc., it seemed like a lot of those malls, and even though they may have been established decades before, had kind of lost that. Like you saw like fountains that were defunct or had been torn out, plantings that had been cut back at a time when malls were making money hand over fist. So like what happened from a maintenance perspective on that kind of in-between era? Because it's not from when they were struggling.
Yeah. I feel like I can only kind of guess at that, honestly, just because, but I think, you know, mall owners are mercenary. The earliest malls had much nicer outsides than your typical mall does today. And basically they discovered within 5 to 10 years that it didn't pay to have like a nice pergola around the outside. Like people weren't spending more money because you had a nice canopy or plantings in the parking lot. You should put all your money inside. So I think by the time that some of these malls, you know, get to be 10, 20 years old, maybe the owners had figured out that they, like, it costs a lot to run the fountain. Maybe the fountain broke and they didn't feel like fixing it, but that they could still be extracting money from the mall without building out and keeping up all of its features. Like the maintenance programs were definitely a huge part of a lot of the kind of early mall articles that I read. I mean, Edward de Bartolo basically said that like people are coming to the mall because we keep it in like tip-top condition. So I think that's a sign of kind of like the second generation of mall ownership, and maybe that at least at that time, you know, retail was booming enough so that you didn't need to offer these additional amenities to the same level. Can I just answer like this wasn't part of your question, but I thought you might be going to like why are these aspects of the malls from the 80s popular again, or like why are our contemporary aesthetics so much of the 80s? I mean, it sounded like that, yeah. Which I just think I think the 80s are now historical. Like, I think this is the right moment for me to write this book and for other people to explore other 80s topics, because we have enough distance on that era to like have nostalgia and want to kind of reboot the aesthetics, but also have distance from our younger selves and want to think about these architectural forms that were so important to us then. I mean, in my book proposal, actually, the first page of it was all about Stranger Things, which season 2 was set. Was it 2 or 3? No, I forget. Sorry. Season 2 was set in a mall, and I'm like, oh, the Duffer Brothers actually grew up really near where I grew up in North Carolina and are only a little bit younger than I am. So it's like this was a sign of the times that we were all thinking about this again.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
The covered bazaar concept that you have in the Middle East a lot, places like Turkey, Istanbul, for example. So is that something that has been done in the U.S. at all, anywhere that you know of?
Well, I mean, I would say there are, you know, kind of more casual covered marketplaces, but those kind of marketplaces often come up in the rhetoric around the mall. I mean, in trying to innovate, the architects and their clients often refer to like the Greek agora or the European gallerias or, you know, marketplaces in Mexico or different countries. And the one place where that definitely comes up is in the development of Faneuil Hall in Boston as a festival marketplace, which was an adaptive reuse project of formerly industrial buildings. And the architects for that, Ben and Jane Thompson, had this whole kind of multimedia slideshow with pictures of cities around the world and marketplaces and banners and fruit and food, because they really wanted their marketplace to be different from the mall, which they saw as kind of plastic wrapped and antiseptic. And so their reference point was definitely things like a Turkish bazaar.
Thank you.
Now, one of the advantages is the weather resistance of malls being totally enclosed. But often when I'm in one, even a very big one, I feel kind of claustrophobic. Are there any malls where they take advantage of the outdoors as well by including a courtyard or a rooftop section, anything like that?
Well, especially in California, there are a fair number of outdoor malls. I didn't break those out so much as a separate category because a lot of them are essentially the mall just with the roof not put on, which is actually much cheaper for their developers. But yeah, there's definitely mixed in with all of the indoor malls, outdoor malls in more clement places. But the indoor mall was really originally sold by Greuen as weather resistant, as you say. The tagline for Southdale was 365 shopping days a year, because in Minnesota, the winter was really a serious deterrent to shopping. So for many years, just like the promise of climate control was, essentially part of the Greuen Transfer, that like you didn't have to, worry about your coat, you didn't have to worry about what the season was once you were inside the mall.
It's interesting to think that, as attractive as that concept was, or as good a fit as it was in Minnesota, because it was resistant to a very cold climate. I think now the promise of AC that the mall offers in the era of climate change, I'm sure it's a draw in countries where a lot of people don't have air conditioning at home. But increasingly here, it seems like if you're going out to meet friends and there's somewhere that is going to be cool and protected from the sun, that might be another reason for the continuing viability of the mall.
Yeah, no, I actually think that's true. And I was talking to Daniel Barber, who's an architectural historian who wrote basically an architectural history of air conditioning about this, because I think this goes to, again, the mall's dual kind of public-private role, because a lot of times during heat waves now people talk in cities about cooling centers and using, community centers and public libraries as cooling centers. But I think that the mall has been and will continue to be like a de facto cooling center. And even though air conditioning is not great for the climate, communal air conditioning is better for the climate than everyone having their own individual unit or kind of cooling their own individual home.
Are there any more questions? Oh.
Hi, I'm Roseanne. In your research, did you come across anything more than anecdotal about developers developing like second stories of malls into smaller apartment homes and keeping shopping and that sort of community thing on the bottom? I'd seen some developers were doing that, but I don't know if it's gained any kind of ground or if you'd come across that.
I actually haven't come across examples of that. And I have to say, when I talk about redeveloping malls, a lot of times people's first thought is, oh, we should make them into housing. But I actually think that's pretty difficult. And I don't think, if you're talking about reusing the actual, architecture and materials of the mall, I think that housing is low on the list of quick and easy adaptive reuse. I think that people should build housing in the parking lots of malls. I think that is the number one thing they should do with the parking lots, and they should build it around the edge so you don't have this big void of space around the architecture of the mall. But then put classrooms or offices or medical things in the mall. It's sort of like converting large 1970s office buildings into housing, which is another thing that comes up a lot. And it's just they don't have the windows, they don't have the plumbing stacked. They're just a series of things that would have to be adapted that are pretty expensive.
I guess if there's no further questions, should we thank
Sure, yeah.
thank
let's have a-
Alexandra for her wonderful and illuminating talk.
Let's thank you both, Alexandra, and thank you, Amanda, as well. I think you all have gotten a taste of, there's much more in the book, and you've gotten a taste of how interesting, fascinating, and informative Alexandra makes this the subject of malls in America. Copies of her book are available at the checkout desk. She'll be up here, very happy to sign any copies you want. Again, a reminder, do not fold